So welcome to the Rise of the Super Being podcast. I'm your host, Vanderson Pires. Our producer, it's Callan Walker. Callan, good to say your name again. And today our guest is Dr. Jane Freeman-Brown. So before we get into, this episode is brought by you by Combat Room Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So if you want to learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, come to see me and my team at www.combatroom.co.nz. So Dr. Jane, how are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So Dr. Jane Freeman-Brown, it's a registered clinical psychologist with 16 years of experience in mental health. And she used to work as senior advisor at the Department of Corrections. And also she has master's degree in Bioethics and Health Law, right?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, through the University of Otago. Also, Dr. Jane, she has been a chairperson of the Ethics Committee of New Zealand College of the Clinical Psychologists. She's also, a private consultant. And so where's your clinic?
I don't have a clinic per se. I consult to other psychologists mainly. Yeah, yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. And also, she's the wife of one of the people I love the most, Conrad.
As do I.
Yes.
It's he's been doing a lot of study in the lockdown.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, we need to catch up. So that's awesome. So, Dr. Jane, how did you start with psychology? It has been over 16 years. So what was your motivation to become a psychologist?
Yeah, so I went to university when I was 18, so that's a very young time to be deciding what your career is. I think like most psychologists, I wanted to get into a helping profession, and I was offered a place in clinical psychology and medical school on the same day. And I thought that I couldn't inject people. So I decided to be a clinical psychologist. I was, I think, attracted to a profession where I could help people with the evidence of science behind it. And so I graduated in 2004. And when I went back to the Department of Corrections as an advisor in 2012, they were very kind enough to put me through a master's degree in bioethics, because a lot of the questions we were being asked from the psychologists in that department were of a psycho-legal or an ethical nature. And the Masters of Bioethics and Health Law that I did through the University of Otago was the most eye-opening and wonderful degree that I have done. And it really sparked an interest in me in ethics and philosophy. And you know that you have hit your niche when you read things for fun, and that's what definitely I do. I now read philosophy, in my spare time.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm just a big geek, but I really enjoy the philosophy side of psychology, because there is a considerable overlap, I think, between psychology and philosophy. So yeah, that's how I've landed here today. Yeah,
that's awesome. Yeah, so really, really interesting. How about the ethics? So why did you choose that as your topic for your masters?
Well, the master's program is a whole program in bioethics and health law. So you have to choose a sort of an ethical topic for your master's thesis. And like I said, I was working at the Department of Corrections, and there was no shortage of ethical dilemmas that were the psychologists working there were being confronted with on a daily basis. And so I chose one of those ethical dilemmas to do my master's thesis on. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, so lots of good questions here for you. So
good.
Let's start. Yeah. Let's start with what's a good life?
Well, that is maybe one of the biggest questions that we as humans face. And I think that, many, or if not all of the great minds since civilization has begun have contemplated that question. So we're probably not going to get the answer today. But the thing is, the first thing to talk about is that we don't actually have a common definition of what a good life is. Many people use the phrase a good life in different ways. So some people might say, oh, he's living a good life, and they might be referring to someone living the high life, a life of luxury and a lot of material wealth. And other people might say, oh, I'm going off to the country to live the good life. And in that way, they're referring to a life of autonomy and self-sufficiency. Did you ever watch the British sitcom The Good Life? Do you know that program? No? So you might be a little bit young, Vanderson, but the Good Life was a BBC sitcom in the 1970s and 1980s, and some of your listeners will be aware of it because they would have grown up with it. But it was about a husband and wife in London who the husband had a job in the city in an office, and he absolutely hated it. And on his 40th birthday, he handed in his resignation, and he went home to his wife and he said, we've got no money now, I'm not going to work anymore, and we're going to live off the land in our house in London. And so they turned their garden into a vegetable garden and had pigs and goats, and the neighbours were incredibly snobby. And so the sitcom is all about the comedy of living off the land. But it was a lovely program, and that kind of phrase, the good life, where you're in total control of your time, has really stuck with a generation. And I do recommend that you have a look at the program. It's dated in some ways and timeless in others. But, so that's another way that we use that phrase, the good life, sort of referring to that self-sufficiency, living off the land kind of life that a lot of people do aspire to. Other people might use the phrase a good life at a funeral, like in giving someone's eulogy. They might say, well, she lived a very good life, meaning that the person was very virtuous. So does the good life mean all of these things or none of these things? We don't have a common definition of what a good life is.
Why is that? Why is it so hard to find this definition?
Well, philosophers would say that we can't come to a common definition because we don't have a universal moral code. We don't all agree about what is the correct way to live. Psychologists would say that we will never come to a universal definition of what a good life is because we're all so different. We all have different values, we all have different interests, we all have different personalities. So someone who's very highly introverted might think that a life of solitude and, reading and being quite isolated, that might be their good life. But for someone who is more extroverted, or for you who loves being socially connected, that would be the definition of hell. And so we can't probably ever have a universal recipe for what a good life is. It's impossible to be too detailed about it. But there is guidance, though. There is guidance that we can all have a think about, but there is no recipe book for what a perfect good life would look like.
That's interesting. So, why we should even consider, what a good life is? Why this question? Why we question ourselves a lot about that?
Because some people might say, well, even contemplating what a good life is a luxury when so many people struggle to survive. But I disagree with that. I think that it's not a matter of why we should consider this question. It's a matter of we must. We have to. There's no option but to consider what a good life is. And the reason is that, the primary biological purpose of life really is survival, surviving long enough to replicate your genetic material or pass it on to others. But in some point of our evolution, we develop this amazingly big frontal lobe. And that frontal lobe allows us or produces in us the ability to evaluate and to take the perspective of others. And if we are going to be evaluating others, we're probably going to be evaluating ourselves as well, or we will be. And so we start to ask the question, what's our life like? What am I willing to do or not do to survive? And if we look at other creatures, they don't have a morality about them. So they will do anything they have to do in order to survive. It's survival at all costs. Like, there's a shark, I think it's called the sand tiger shark, who will eat its own siblings in order to survive.
Oh, that's so interesting.
There's no morality there.
Yeah.
So, but because we develop these big frontal lobes, we have the capacity for empathy, we have the capacity to evaluate. And so we then naturally come to this question, well, what is the right way to live? How should I be living? You don't get to be like the sand tiger shark and eat your siblings. It stops you from surviving. Our frontal lobe and our capacity for morality stops us from surviving at any cost. Given this, it is a worthwhile and necessary question to ask yourself, what is a good life for me? Most people want to spend their short time on earth in a good way, in a worthwhile way. And so when they can, if they get to experience being on a deathbed, they can look back and say, I attempted to live a good life, or I learned to live a good life. I didn't harm anyone intentionally. I didn't eat my siblings.
Yeah.
I contributed to the common good in a way that I was able to, and I did something meaningful.
I love that. That's super cool. Super cool. So what's the guidance available for us?
Yes. Yeah.
So just one thing before you mention. So what's the good life looks like? You started to describe right now. Those examples. So what's that looks like?
So we'll come to that. I think first of all, it might be worth thinking about, guidance in general, because I think that that is all that is available is guidance.
Right.
People search long and hard for an answer, don't they? They may be even watching this podcast or listening to the podcast, searching for an answer.
I already was rushing to the things to ask the question. Yeah.
And unfortunately, there is no, as I said before, there's no recipe book. And actually, Viktor Frankl, in his book Man's Search for Meaning, which is a wonderful book, I know you like
it's one
that
of
book.
my favorites. Yeah.
He said, one of his main messages was that we shouldn't be looking for answers. That is the wrong thing to do, because we could be searching forever. That the answers, if we're asking the universe what the answer is, that is the wrong thing to do. And he said we need to invert that, and we need to be cognizant that the universe is actually asking us the question,
I love that.
Yeah, what is a good life for you? And that searching for a long time for this perfect answer from somebody else's head is futile. And also, if we think about Socrates, one of the most ancient philosophers and one of the most wisest minds that there's ever been, the young men of Athens would flock to him, and they would say to him, "Tell us. You are the wisest man. Tell us what is the meaning of life." And he would never ever give a lecture. He would never do what I'm doing, talking like this. He would only ever ask his students questions. And that's where the term Socratic questioning comes from. His questions weren't just basic questions. They were punch you in the face kind of pertinent questions to get his students to really think long and hard and to get the answers from themselves, because everyone does have that innate knowledge inside of themselves. And so that is what Viktor Frankl was talking about as well, is you actually have the answers in yourself. You need the right questions. So we shouldn't be searching for an answer. We should be searching for the right questions. And that sort of goes back to the guidance. The guidance that we should be seeking is the right questions.
Right.
Also, if we think about professions in life, like, medicine, psychologists, lawyers, accountants. Each of those professions over time have considered what is the right way for this particular professional to act. And so each of those professions has come up with a code of ethics, a formal document that considers what is the right way to live as one of those particular professions. But if you read one of those codes of ethics, they're very general. They only give very, very broad guidance. They do not give you a detailed answer of how to act in a particular dilemma at all. And that's all that they've been able to come to, is this very general guidance. And we seek something more concrete when we've got a dilemma, but it's not available. Guidance only is available. But it's a good start.
Yeah.
Good guidance should give you good questions, good things to think about. But that's the first answer. How do you lead a good life? You have to construct that yourself.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. But we do have some guidance.
Yeah, so what's the guideline?
Yeah,
let's get into that.
Yeah, let's get into that. Your listeners might consider, doing their own reading, etc. And there is a lot of amazing texts out there. Man's Search for Meaning being one of my favourites. But in my reading of the literature, I think it can be distilled down to 5 broad guiding principles to think about when you are trying to answer the question for yourself, what is a good life for me? Yeah. So the first consideration is to be able to maximize your autonomy within the limits of your reality. Now, autonomy is a massive issue. All philosophers, I suspect, would agree that autonomy is crucial to life satisfaction. So autonomy broadly can be defined as governing yourself, the capacity to live according to your own wishes, and the opposite of autonomy would be oppression, being forced to bend to the will of others or having to live in a way that you don't believe in. And that's obviously a surefire recipe for unhappiness and not leading a good life. Autonomy can be thought of as external or internal to you. And, for some people who are in prison, or, Viktor Frankl was in a concentration camp, the limits of reality are such that they are not leading a life that is completely of their own will and are not able to. Yeah. So it's not just about external autonomy, it's also about internal. So externally, autonomy sort of refers to how much of your life and your time can you lead according to your own wishes rather than someone else's. And a lot of people think about employment in this regard. Yeah. And we have to really listen to ourselves, know our personality, because that will influence how much autonomy is right for us. So if we take the employment example, people will have differing responsibility and risk tolerance levels that they're happy with. And so for some people, they're willing to sacrifice some level of autonomy for the security of a paycheck. And that's what's good for them. But for others, they're not willing for that at all. And to be, dictated to, if that's not too strong a word, by an employer for 40 hours plus a week is their definition of hell. And that if they were defining what a good life for them was, then working for themselves would be part of that. That autonomy over their time would have to be maximised. But some people don't want that. So it's really asking yourself the question, how much autonomy do I want? How much autonomy am I comfortable with? What is my personality? And fitting your desire for autonomy into that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, that's clarify so many things. If you put it this way, autonomy. Yeah, that's awesome. So that's the first guideline.
Yeah, but autonomy can also be internal to us, and can we be totally free and lead a good life if we are governed by norms and beliefs that aren't actually ours? How can you live an authentic life if your belief structure is not actually yours, but it's influenced by, sources that you don't entirely believe in, or that you haven't held up to the light of day and said, actually, yes, this is something I do believe in. Yeah. So Erich Fromm is a German-American philosopher, and he said, man can be a slave even without being put in chains.
Oh,
he's a wonderful
so
writer.
powerful.
I absolutely recommend that you give his book To Have or To Be a read. It's an amazing book. He's a philosopher that's not talked about a lot, but I absolutely love his writings. He writes very beautifully as well. But what he was referring to with that phrase was he talked a lot about materialism being one of the examples of those chains that we put on ourselves that prevent ourselves from having full autonomy. He also talked about narcissism too, which we'll come back to when we talk about ego. But in terms of materialism, he was saying that we are too suggestible to media and advertising. Obviously, social media was before his time, but we are susceptible to influences that we don't really think about. We just take on board, and then suddenly we find ourselves not making decisions that are made based on our authentic beliefs, but they're based on status or ego, that type of thing, and that prevents someone from being fully free. Yeah. We'll come back to that point again, I think, when we talk about...
I love that.
Yeah.
Even, your example of that as well, because, you build just, few months ago, I know you guys spend so much time, so much money, and you build this lovely shop about, selling chocolate.
Yeah.
So beautiful, the attention on details and everything. And I wasn't expect you to let it go, and you just was explaining to me the reasons why, right? So why did you invest so much, your time, your money, and after you just decide, okay, I'm gonna let it go?
It illustrates a point that we should listen to ourselves and what is right for us. And so, I love creating things. I also have a very sweet tooth. So creating a sweet shop or a chocolate shop was a dream, and I loved the creation of it. It was some of the happiest moments of my life, creating this shop that I tried to get as beautiful as I could. But the running of it, the day-to-day running of it, because it was a 7-day-a-week kind of venture, took me away from other things that I loved more, like, my husband and my home and my pets. And so the decision was, in listening to that, there's no shame in taking a left turn and giving something a go, but then listening to yourself and asking yourself, is this right for me? And if it's not right for you, there's no shame in taking a different track or backtracking and going, oh, that was an interesting sideline, and I've learned that that's not for me. There's no shame in that. That is autonomy. That is designing the life that you want. And there's never going to be a perfect trajectory where everything is linear and at 18 years what you want to do for the rest of your life. There's no shame in that. I think that there's more shame in carrying on with something that's not right for you. In my clinical practice, when I had a clinical practice, sometimes I would have people come in, say in their 30s or something like that, absolutely distraught that they were a lawyer or something like that, because mum and dad wanted them to be a lawyer, but that they were really introverted or something like that, and they didn't want to be a lawyer, but they were too afraid to backtrack and try something else because they felt that they needed to keep going with this because they'd invested a lot in it. And they were committing themselves to a life of misery because and my job was to try and increase their courage to discover the right path for them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, some people are lucky that, you know, when they're very young, they will have, you know, hit the nail on the head
Mm-hmm.
as regards to what they want to do. And that's lovely and wonderful. But not everyone is like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm.
That's so interesting. So we touch on the first guideline, and so was autonomy.
Yep. So the question would be to ask yourself, how much autonomy do I want, and how much autonomy can I get, and what's the how do I design my life to get to the level of autonomy that's right for me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And that might take some very courageous decisions.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, so what's the second?
Well, the next one I think you'll enjoy because it's something that I think I've heard you talk about before. But that is, you know, we need to pursue a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose. And I would add that could be in an area that requires discipline. And I've got a BJJ example. Because I think that beyond survival, human beings need a sense of purpose, of meaning. And to just carry on from the last point, autonomy is very important, but not sufficient for a good life. Necessary but not sufficient, because sometimes people will get a lot of autonomy over their life, like when they retire, would be a common example.
That's a really good point.
Or if they win lotto, which would be a less common example. But what we find with those people who are suddenly thrust into this life with a lot of autonomy, that they can get a sense of emptiness if they don't also have purpose. And that's hard to imagine with a lotto example, but there is a lot of literature suggesting that, you know, those rare people who do win lotto, you know, they have a hedonistic lifestyle for a few months, maybe a few years, and then there's a real sense of emptiness because the pursuit of pleasure alone is not enough. The maximum autonomy over their life is not enough. Human beings also require a sense of meaning.
Yes.
And if you don't have it, there is a real sense that something's not right. Yeah.
I love that. That's a really good point about autonomy. Yeah. You know, that's such a common thing. You know, people retired and get depression straight away. You know?
Yes, they do. They do, because work was their purpose. And now that work is finished or no longer needed, there is no other purpose. So that is, and it's okay that your purpose in life or your meaning in life changes throughout your time on earth. That's okay as well. You don't just need one purpose, but you have to have a purpose.
Yes.
And again, going back to that point about Viktor Frankl, people will search long and hard for what is the meaning, what is the meaning of life, or what is their purpose in life. And my advice is that you have to try things out. You have to give things a go in order to find what lands. You know, obviously BJJ landed for you. That's you know, you found that. What age were you when you found out that was your purpose, one of your purposes in life?
I think I was 14. Yeah, I was kind of 13, 14 years old. Yeah. You know, so but it started as having fun, enjoying that.
Yes,
And of course, you know, as you said, I try other things in life as well. So, you know, I went to university to become a journalist.
I didn't know that.
You know, so you know that for a period of time as well was a massive purpose for my life. And music as well. I love music, and also playing an instrument was another thing. You know, but jiu-jitsu always there, following. You know, being part of this searching.
Yes, yeah, and that's it. That the search is an important part. There's nothing wrong with the search. It's, I think, important for children to try lots of things in order to see what lands for them, what gives them a sense of meaning. So, we find meaning by our values in life. And a question to ask yourself is, what would I do, what would I continue to do, even if I had maximum autonomy? If I won lotto, what would I still do? Another question would be, what would get me out of the house and doing something if it was like the darkest, rainiest, awful night of the year? What do I really hold importance for? What do I value? Because that's your meaning, that's your why, some people would say. And yes, you may not know it at 13, 14. That's okay. That's absolutely okay. But it is a little bit of know thyself, know what you value, know what's important for you. It could be more than one thing. That's okay. I think you're blessed if you've got more than one purpose in life. But it shouldn't just be a pursuit of happiness. That happiness, exclusive pursuit of happiness, I think is a bit of a trap that lots of people get into because we adapt to situations of happiness so quickly, and then you're left with emptiness again.
That's such interesting.
So some people might say, oh, my life will be good, or I'll be happy when I buy my first house. And that's a good goal to go for, but you'll find that after you buy your first house, after a few months in it, the novelty will wear off, and happiness should be viewed as a byproduct of meaning, something that comes as a sideline to meaning. The pursuit of meaning is more important than the pursuit of happiness.
I love that. That's so interesting. Even I read this, something explain about why our sense of time as we get adults, starts
to go faster. Yeah.
So because exactly what you said, we lose the sense of, when we are young, not child, Christmas is that, we wait for that moment, birthdays or, and after adult life, time just seems, why? Because we lose that sense of novelty, right?
Yeah, that's right, so I also think that discipline is really important.
So this is our third one?
No,
not yet.
Discipline in terms of, finding a purpose that also requires a bit of discipline. Because I think we like to be challenged.
Yes.
I think that is a good thing for human beings to be challenged, to do something that is takes us out of our comfort zone. Because if everything was easy for us, I think it would lack a little bit of that meaning and importance. It wouldn't feel worthwhile. I think BJJ is a good example of this. Because it requires great discipline, doesn't it? I mean, you would know more than I do. I'm just built for being in a cave and stirring the pot. But I think, watching my husband do BJJ is been really rewarding to see the meaning that he gets out of it, but the discipline that's required to get that meaning as well. I think having discipline is a very important skill for people to learn. And again, a little bit with meaning, I don't think that there's any magic answer about what discipline is or how to get discipline. There might be a few little motivational tips here and there, but how many people search for how do I become more motivated, or how do I become more disciplined? It's a billion-dollar industry.
Yes, so true.
And really the reality is that it is something that you have to practice. It's a sticky plaster thing that you have to do. Just do it. That discipline comes with more discipline. With the practice of discipline.
Yes.
There is stop seeking answers outside of yourself and just give things a go. Is I guess the guidance.
I love that. That's so interesting. So interesting. So discipline, discipline is it's a massive thing.
And also to find out what your interests are, because we're very different in terms of temperament and personality. And what might interest one person won't interest another. And that's absolutely fine. We're not all built the same. We have different interests, and luckily we do. But if you're feeling a bit wishy-washy about something, well, you need to listen to that and go, well, okay, I'm not particularly interested in this. Find what you are interested in.
Yes.
I do a little bit of creative writing. And when I was in my less enlightened 30s, I used to write, I'd struggle with my creative writing. And, I had read a lot of literary fiction and those kind of novels. And I felt frustrated that I was never motivated when I would go to write something lofty for adults. And I had to do a lot of soul searching about why that was. And then I turned to romance writing, and again, it just wouldn't come out. I loved the act of writing, but when I would sit down to write these books for adults, it just wouldn't come. And I got really frustrated about that. And then one day, I sat down and I literally said out aloud to my cat, just write whatever you would like to read yourself. And I started writing children's fiction. And I don't have children, and I didn't think that would ever be a genre that I would be interested in. But that by asking myself that very detailed question, I got out my interest, which was children's literature.
That's so interesting.
I never would have predicted that, because I was a little bit of a literary snob. Those are the sorts of, that's how you find out what your interests are. Yeah, asking yourself questions, Peering back ego and what other people might think of you is the way to find your particular interests, your personality. Finding out who you are is very important, because that will lead you on the right path of meaning.
That's awesome. That's super cool. Very, very powerful. I love what you said about trying new things, experimenting new things, to trying to find your path.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's super cool.
It's okay to do a year of the violin and then absolutely hate it.
Yes.
Okay.
That's so interesting. Okay, so now we go for so it's 5. So we got the 2, right?
We've got autonomy.
Autonomy.
Meaning.
Yes. And now what's the third one?
Contribute to the common good. Yeah, because or at least don't intentionally harm society. The reason is that leading a good life is unlikely to involve the exclusive pursuit of your own pleasure. Yeah? Leading a good life is not just a subjective judgment. I think if you are wanting to lead a good life, then other people have to look in and say, yes, that person didn't just meet their own wishes and needs, because that's actually the definition of narcissism. It's just going after your own needs and thinking that your needs and wishes are more important than anyone else's. I believe there is a moral obligation to contribute to the common good of society if you can. At the very least, I think that moral obligation is not to intentionally harm society. But that would be a pretty minimum level if you have the capacity to contribute in some way. So in our society, there's always going to be vulnerable people who need our assistance. And I'm not talking about giving up all your possessions and, sacrificing everything. I'm talking about just in some way that you give back, or that you assist people who are struggling to survive. And you don't need to look very far for those people. Just by age alone, there are vulnerable people in society, the very young and the very old. And it is a good thing to do, to contribute to society by helping the very young and the very old. Also animals. So animals are vulnerable because they depend on us. But there's lots of little ways or creative ways that you can meet this criteria or think about this guidance. And I think that, parents who are very busy raising children in a way that's morally responsible is contributing to the good of society. There are many different ways. And again, I think connecting to the meaning criteria, it's useful for you to ask yourself if meaning and contributing can overlap for you. So for me, I love the elderly, and so contributing to rest homes, etc. I also love animals, so contributing to animals is the way that I want to give back to society. Yeah.
That's so interesting. Super cool. Yeah, I always think about I love that, even the power of being a volunteer, I think that's such a powerful thing. We had, few guests who has donated their time, and this is something I try my best to practice as well. But I like to follow kind of this rule, every time we interact with someone, we can make their day better, we can keep the same, or we can make it worse, So always trying to, or I'm gonna, keep the same or make it their day better. That's my rule to help to give my little contribution as well to society, as you said. I think that's
well, I think Vanderson, you are a real inspiration in that, because no. My observation is that you give an enormous amount back to society, and that is very inspiring. Very inspiring. That you came to New Zealand, you had to learn another language, and you had so many things that you could have. You could have focused your time just solely on your own advancement, and you didn't. So I think that is just so admirable.
Thank you so much. I'm trying to find the meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yes.
So now we go for the fourth one. Which one is the fourth one?
The fourth one is about. The fourth and the fifth ones are huge and very difficult. The fourth one is about mastering your emotional experience.
I love that. It's a massive one, yeah.
It is, because in terms of leading a good life, most people would say they want to be happy. But like we've talked about, the exclusive pursuit of happiness is a trap. It also implies that anything less than consistent happiness is bad and to be avoided. And a really weird thing happened in psychology in the 1980s, where emotions got labelled as good and bad, or negative and positive. And psychologists in this day and age have really tried to steer away from that, in that all emotions have evolved for a reason. So there's four primary emotions: sadness, happiness, fear, and anger. You can get variations on those, obviously, but those are the four primary emotions, and they all evolved for a reason, and so they can't be good or bad. They are useful. They can occur at levels which are helpful and not helpful. Right. And so the guidance is for people to learn how to master their emotional experience, so that emotions don't overwhelm them and lead to poor decisions. Yeah. So I think we really need to get away from this happiness is the only emotion you want to pursue or to feel, because I think that's wrong. That all emotions are useful at a level where they're not overwhelming you. So, for example, a little bit of sadness can actually be very helpful, because it may then cause you to reflect on your life and make the necessary changes in order to lead a better life. So too much sadness is obviously unhelpful, particularly if it occurs at a level where you feel you can't even leave your bed. But I think we need to get away from that understanding or conceptualization that emotions are good or bad, and that you should only feel good emotions or positive emotions. Negative emotions evolved for a reason. Well, the emotions that have been termed negative, like sadness, anger, and fear, they will tell you important information. The definition of wisdom includes emotion. Wisdom can be defined as knowing what is the right thing to do, listening to reason and emotion.
Wow, I love that.
So we need to conceptualize our emotions as a system that is as biological as your heart and lungs, but you need to learn how to master it, because you'll know, having worked in prisons, etc., that people's emotions can get the better of them, and they become impulsive and behave in ways that they wouldn't if the emotion had been more regulated. It's not an absence of emotion at all. That's a psychopath, basically. You don't want to have an absence of emotion. That would be really weird, to live without emotion. How then could you connect with someone?
Yes.
You want emotion, but you want to learn how to master your emotions so that they can aid you and not debilitate you. Yeah. So I like to think of emotions on a thermometer. Yeah. So where, the middle part of the thermometer is the regulated part of emotion. It's where emotion is helpful, because you need to listen to emotions. Fear would be a good example. If we're feeling a little bit of fear, it probably means we need to be alert to something in our environment. Too much fear and we become paralyzed, and that's not helpful. But emotions are very, very important that we listen to if we want to be, wise and lead a good life. Also, under this broad guidance is the ability to feel love and compassion and to connect. Would there be any such thing as a good life without some type of meaningful relationship, whether that be romantic or friendship, or when I was doing a bit of reading for this podcast, I was sitting out in the sun, and one of my dogs came up at just a time when I was thinking about relationships, and she put her head through my arm. I was like, well, thank you for reminding me. A meaningful relationship can be with an animal as well. You can feel huge love and connection with an animal. It doesn't just need to be a human. I think it is possible for someone to lead quite an isolated life in terms of being isolated from other humans, but have meaningful connections with animals.
That's beautiful. I love that. And I agree. I have a cat, and we have this relationship. Yeah, it's him, Alfie.
Alfie. Yeah.
It's so true. Yeah, and especially those days we stay at home, and the importance of Alfie, that little creature.
Yeah. And you talk to them.
Of course.
And sometimes they answer back.
Yeah.
Our emotional experience is a crucial part of leading a good life.
Yes.
But it is about learning to master it, because it can get away on us very easily, and for some people more so than others. Yeah.
So any tips? So for example, if someone experience a little bit too much of the anger, for example, or one of those emotions. So what's your advice for someone experience a little bit of too much of those four emotions?
Yeah. I think you need to be able to, and this is part of being an adult, isn't it, is learning. All of these things that we're talking about, I think, are learned through reflection, and practice and experience. And I think someone who's struggling with a particular emotion, whether it be anger or sadness, whatever, they need to learn how to soothe themselves. Unfortunately, when people struggle with a particular emotion, it can mean that in their formative years, like 0 to 12 or 0 to 18 kind of thing, our real developmental years, where we're growing from being a child to an adult, it often means that they didn't learn how to soothe themselves because they weren't soothed properly themselves. And so that is a thing that they need to relearn or to learn as an adult. What soothes them, what dampens down that emotion so it becomes useful to them and not in that really hot, angry kind of state where anyone, and we can all get up to that level, but some of us are slower to get up to that heightened emotion than others. But when we are at that heightened level of emotion, we all behave in ways that we would not normally behave. So learning how to soothe yourself as quickly, learning how to recognize the emotion would be the first thing, but then learning how to soothe, what do I need to do to soothe myself? And again, people look for answers outside themselves. You need to understand what works for you. Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, so it's leading us to I'm super curious. What's the number 5?
I think I've left the hardest to last. And perhaps the one that we might spend the longest on. The 5th guidance for how to lead a good life is learning how to master your ego. I think this is the most complex, sophisticated, psychologically sophisticated thing that a human being can accomplish. And lots of people perhaps may not ever accomplish it. Let's define the ego first.
Yes, that would be my question.
I might just have a drink first.
Yeah. Because this is another thing as well. We hear a lot, so for example, in conversations, with friends, especially, when we like someone or when we don't, when we don't like someone. So when we like someone, said, that person, it's really nice that, there's no ego.
Yes.
And when we don't like, I know that person, it has a big ego. But I don't believe, the majority of people who say those things, they actually know the definition of. I think that will be my first question. So what's the ego?
Well, I think I'd better just qualify this by saying that in the literature, the ego is actually very difficult to define, and there's quite a few definitions of ego. But just for our purposes, let's define the ego as the image of yourself and the importance that you hold of yourself. So how important do I think I am? How do I perceive my image relative to others? Because that's what the ego, if we kind of label it like that, that's what the ego is interested in. What do other people think of me? Do I think that I'm superior or inferior to others? Status is obviously the food of the ego. So, I mean, you can never get rid of an ego. Of course, you have to have some type of image of yourself. But I think it's how important do I think I am is the potential pathological part of the ego. Are you watching The Last Dance?
No.
Callum is. Yeah. Have you not watched The Last Dance?
It's funny because I don't watch anything. I don't watch anything. It's a mess of a thing. But for example, I don't.
There's no net TV.
Okay.
I don't have TV. Yeah, that's the thing. So I try.
Okay.
Even the other day, talk about the pandemic and blah blah blah. I think one of the that's my theory, okay? That's what I think I wasn't that affected on that sense because I never watched any zombie apocalypse type of movie. I never watched that in my entire life. I have no idea. So for example, Emily, my wife, she's watched those things a lot. So I kind of. It's funny because I think the way we reacted to that was completely different. And one of the things I address, I think Maybe I was a little bit more relaxed because I never watched any movie, so I didn't have those seeds, you know.
Yes, yes.
But I heard about that
Right.
through the paper, the Last Dance,
Yeah,
but I
okay.
don't know what's about it.
Okay, so The Last Dance is a documentary primarily about Michael Jordan, presuming you know who he is.
Yes, yeah. Okay.
Just checking. And I mean, it's I think it is primarily about him, but it's also about the Chicago Bulls and their, the time where they won all those championships in the 90s. Yeah. The reason why I was bringing it up was because if we become too heavily invested in our ego, in our image of, in our importance, it can lead to appalling behaviour by other people, by appalling behaviour within ourselves. If we believe that we have more worth than other people, or if we believe that we're more important than other people, it can really affect your behaviour. And there was an example, Callum will know, in The Last Dance where Scottie Pippen, one of the players in the Chicago Bulls, there was a game, I think, and maybe in 1994, where they were playing the Knicks in one of the, I don't know if it was the final, it might have been the final, and there was like 1.8 seconds to go, and I think they needed one more goal to win, and so the coach called a timeout to set up the play for them to win, and the coach didn't give Scottie Pippen the final play, and he was so angry at that he refused to go back on the court. I think that's an example of when, and they asked him about that in this Last Dance documentary, and his answer was very interesting. He said he didn't regret doing that. Yeah.
Oh,
So
really?
yeah, so it was a really interesting observation of ego at that time and ego currently. But whenever you put yourself above the common good of your team, there's something that's gone a little bit awry with ego, and I think it's something to be very mindful of, because we can all be too invested in our ego. It can affect our decisions on a daily basis, and we have to be very, very finely attuned to ourselves to even be able to observe our ego. I think that's a really sophisticated psychological skill, is to be able to observe your ego and separate yourself from that. And yeah, boy, that is a pretty hard thing to do. But I admire animals, as you know, a lot, because they have no ego. They are not worried if their collar's naff, or if their kennel's not in the latest style. And I think then you get purity of character. You get exactly, you get an authentic sense of that creature. And for people who don't have a massive ego, or are not too, another way of saying that would be someone who's not heavily invested in their ego, you get a sense of the true person, and you get a sense that they know who they are without the trappings of ego. The trappings of ego would be investments in wanting people to think that you are important or superior. The trappings of ego would also be people who get a spike of feeling superior when they can put other people down, or make other people feel inferior, or believe that other people are inferior. And that is a common human experience. But it's being able to separate, observe that is the ego, not the authentic self. I guess the next issue is, why is a big ego a problem? And the answer is a little bit like your meditation jar that you were showing, that the ego will create an enormous amount of noise in your head, because the ego is always wanting more, more, more. The ego is always trying to defend their position, and increase their importance, and increase their status increasing its progression in the eyes of others, and that can create a lot of activity that is not authentic to the self.
Mm-hmm.
Keeping up with the Joneses. Have you heard that phrase?
No.
Okay, so that's sort of like it's a common phrase in the English language. You'll have the equivalent in Brazil. It means that you are making financial or other decisions to keep up with your neighbours. Yeah.
Okay.
So the neighbours are always the Joneses. Yeah. Yeah. So that is classic ego-driven behaviour.
Mm-hmm.
That if the neighbours get a swimming pool, you need to then save up for a swimming pool. If the neighbours upgrade their car, suddenly your car's not good enough, and that you need to get a new car. They are all ego-driven behaviours and decisions, and like I said, it creates an enormous amount of noise and evaluation in your head that you don't actually need.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the happiest people that you meet are people who really don't care what others think of them. Yeah. And I think we need to care a little bit, because there is, I guess, a danger that if you don't care at all, then you might not take the other people's perspective into account.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe the ego is slightly protective, but it can get too inflated. You can become too invested in how other people see you.
Mm-hmm.
And then you might get one of two things. One, you could become very fearful of what others think of you, to the point where you become paralyzed whenever you're in a position where other people might evaluate you. The other not so great byproduct of being too attached to your ego would be, of course, narcissism, where you believe that you are so important that you don't consider carefully what your actions the impact of your actions on others. And that's not a good thing for society. It certainly doesn't lead to living a good life on our criteria that we've been talking about, because then why would you then contribute to the common good if your needs and wishes are held more highly than everyone else's? Yeah.
That's so interesting. Do you think the with the animals as well? I love what you said about the. I get, of course, I don't know even if it has any science behind of that,
Yes.
but the idea of, do you think they are authentic, they are no ego because they're fully present? I get the sense of, my cat, he's present, he's not overthink about the things, and maybe that's the reason why they are no ego, because they're, for them it's just that moment, right, exists.
Yeah. I think that is the point of the day. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. It is exactly that if the ego is making it noisy in your head, how can you be present in the moment? And I think you lead a good life if you have high quality attention in the moment, because you get to suck all the joy out of the moment, in a good way. That, yes, when I'm walking the dogs and I'm looking at them joyfully bounding along, I think you're absolutely right in the moment. They're not worried about what went before or what's coming up in the future. They are absolutely joyful because they are in the moment. And I mean, I love animals for that. We can learn so much from them by observing how they are and hypothesizing how they're living their life. But yes, I absolutely agree with that point. I think it's an excellent point that to lead a good life, you need to reduce ego noise and have high quality attention right in the moment without fear of what's coming up or regret of what's happened. You don't have control over any of those things. I do think that being fully present in the moment for every moment is impossible and probably not advisable, because I think some planning is perhaps needed. And, I was thinking about this the other day, and I was thinking animals must be able to time project somewhat, because otherwise why would they, why would squirrels gather up food for the winter? I don't know the answer to that, but yeah, high quality attention in the moment is something that we should practice, and it is a sophisticated psychological skill to be able to detach from time projecting forward and time projecting backwards. Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, so now this is something I've been waiting to ask as well, because that's gonna it's gonna connect with the ego. So how's the social media now effective, or or master our ego?
Yeah.
And I'm gonna listen to every single word that you're saying, even more, because I know you have no social media.
Yeah.
So you.
Yeah.
I know you. And why is that?
I don't like what social media does to my ego. It makes. Let me just backtrack a little bit. I think the first question to ask before we go to social media, which is connected, and that is it even possible to master our ego?
Yeah, good one.
And I think I've got another BJJ example. I think it is possible, but that it's a lifelong practice to learn how to master your ego. I think the practice of the virtue of humility is the way to go. Yeah. And that is having a modest view of one's importance and one's significance to what they do. So here's the BJJ example.
That's super powerful. I love that.
So here's the BJJ example. So when you go on the mat and you submit someone, you have displayed your skill to the best of your ability. But if you submit someone, if you are heavily invested in your ego, what would you do?
Celebrate and scream and shout. And
if you were heavily invested in your ego, you would take all of the credit.
Yeah.
But if you weren't so heavily invested in your ego, you would be humble about it, and you would acknowledge your teacher, your teammates, anyone else who had helped you in acquiring that level of skill. And you would also, I think, if you were really humble, you would even think more widely than that, and you would give some of that credit to your parents, perhaps, who had raised you and sacrificed a lot for you to even be here today. And you would even, what I love about the Māori culture is that you would also acknowledge your ancestors, because here you are practicing BJJ, living in a democratic society, because of the sacrifices that they went through, that your submission on that mat at that particular time has a little bit to do with you, but not solely to do with you.
Holy. Tell me more, please. And also go back to nature as well. No, even say thank you to nature as well.
Yes,
no,
beautiful. Exactly.
I'm healthy, I'm able to do that.
Yes, yeah.
Please tell me more. That's so interesting.
Well, I learned this from my grandmother. My grandmother has passed away. She was born in 1910. Can you think about what it was like to be a woman in 1910? She grew up, she was 8 when she was in middle childhood when the First World War was going on. She then lived through the Depression, World War II, etc., etc. She gave birth to 4 children. And, she was a special person in my life and taught me a lot. And I remember once in my 20s, I spent a lot of my 20s flying around the world, leading this amazing life. And she once said to me, how lucky you are to be a woman in, 2001, because those opportunities were not available to her. And it really has always stuck with me that I was living that type of life because of sacrifices previous generations have been through, and that we should always be very grateful to our ancestors and keep them alive, and to really, one, always be very grateful, but always acknowledge that they are part of us, they are part of our accomplishments. I was very fortunate to have amazing parents as well who put me through university, and so my degrees are not my degrees, they are also their degrees. And so that's the mastering your ego comes through the practice of humility. When we don't practice humility, if we take on our successes as wholly ours.
Wow, that's so powerful. I love it.
And that links to social media.
Yes.
Social media, I think, is one of those, most things in life have good things and bad things about them. Most things in life have advantages and disadvantages. And I do believe that social media obviously has its advantages in connecting people. Yeah. But I believe, and I read this recently, so it's not my own idea or opinion, but it's not my own idea, but I share it, so it is also my opinion. I think that intellectually, humans have got the capacity to create something like social media, but I don't think we have the emotional intelligence. We're not ready for it in terms of our emotional intelligence. Because what does social media do? The people who designed these platforms are smart. They know that we're attached to our egos. Now, wouldn't social media be a little bit different if there wasn't the likes function?
Yeah.
Or wouldn't it be different if you couldn't see how many people were viewing it? It becomes compulsive and addictive to see how much adoration you have through social media. And I came off all platforms because I found that I was displaying addictive behaviors. I was looking at it going, oh, how many people have liked it? How many people are following me or whatever like that? I didn't like it. I didn't like the way that it inflated my ego or devastated it if there was, a negative comment. So I think it's just easier, less noisy, not to be on social media. But I absolutely appreciate that some people, do like it, and I appreciate that people connect over it, which is its true good function. But for me, the negatives outweigh the positives. And I believe, from my observation, that social media is enhancing people's ego to an alarming level. And I think that people need to ask themselves, am I sharing this post, or am I going on this social media platform to truly connect, or am I seeking admiration and status, and thereby inflating my ego? And that's a very hard question to honestly answer. So that's what I have to say about social media. I'm not a fan because I don't see it used to its true purpose. I see it being used for further attachment to ego, and I don't think the world needs more of that. I don't think it aids our humanness in any way. I think it detracts from it. Would people still be so attached to it if it didn't have comments and likes and the ability to see how many people, were viewing you or following you? I think it's we've come unstuck a little bit, I believe, in the modern world.
That's so interesting. We can see even the Pavlov experiment, with social media, because even the little bell, when you get a notification,
Yes.
it's there, So even
You start to salivate.
yeah. So even that trait,
Yes.
we can see, it's the social condition,
Absolutely.
It's and we are addicted to those things. The ones are on those platforms, we have to accept the fact. Yes, I'm addicted to this thing, and that's it. Okay, how can I, deal with that as addiction, right?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, you're not a TV watcher, but Killer may have watched it. Last Chance You.
Well, which one is this one?
This is another documentary series on Netflix, and it's about various groups of young men going through a football program in America. And, you're watching it and they're all on their phones all the time. It is addictive. And also, if you're on your phone when you're in another situation, you cannot have that high quality attention in the moment. You cannot split your attention. Our brains don't work like that. You can have superficial attention on two competing tasks, but you can't have high quality attention. You have to put your phone down and attend. You can't attend and be on to something and be on your phone at the same time. So, yeah.
That's so interesting. Dr. Jane, I don't even know what to say because there's so many good lessons in this, I love every single second of this podcast. Can you recommend more of your reading? So, you mentioned Eric Fromm, right? Which other authors do you recommend us to read to find more information and to get inspired, to get, to live a good life?
Yes, yeah. Well, I think the first text to read is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. It is a pivotal text, beautifully written, not long. It's not a very long text at all, but packs a mean punch. It's quite confronting to read. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist who was in a concentration camp, and he wrote the book in 1945. He's written other texts as well, which I would recommend people read. I think another one of his is called Say Yes to Life. Yeah.
Even has lots of YouTube videos of him doing interviews online. Yeah, I love that. I think I watch you all because
brilliant. Yeah.
So interesting to see him talk as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
Eric Fromm would be another one that I would recommend to people. There is also an amazingly wonderful website called Brain Pickings, I think it's called, www.brainpickings.
I subscribe to this one.
Yeah, it's fabulous.
Yes,
it is.
Yes.
I'm
going to even put the link.
Yes, please do, because I'm a total fan of it. And it's Maria...
Poparovic.
That's the one, yeah.
Poparovic.
She writes beautifully, and she also condenses things in very easy to digest ways, and she also has amazing recommendations of books. She writes about Eric Fromm quite a bit, but she also...
Yeah, I was glad when you mentioned because I followed that.
Oh, yeah, cool. And yeah, so I mean,
Eric Fromm,
that would be a way to get a lot of philosophical information in a very easy and free way. Although, obviously she's on, I think, Patreon. You can donate for her amazing work that she does. I think she's one of my favourite writers on the web. Who else? There's lots of... I quite like Alan de Botton.
Yes, the English.
Yes,
I love his School of Life.
Yes.
Yeah, he has a series of on YouTube with those kind of short videos, School of Life.
Yes.
Yeah.
He writes beautifully. He wrote a really good book called Status Anxiety. And some of the other books that I have are often kind of condensing a lot of philosophical opinions and arguments. There's a really good book called Happiness by, I think the writer's name is Frederick Lenoir. That's an amazing book. Another top pick would be Consolations of the Forest. Do you know that book?
No, this one.
If you like nature and animals, you would like this. So this, I can't remember the author, I'm afraid, but Consolations of the Forest is written by a French philosopher, I think, who got a bit sick of modern day life. And a little bit like Henry David Thoreau, he went into, he took 6 months off work and went to live in Siberia for 6 months. And he wrote about his experience. It's almost like a diary of that 6 months, and it's very, very well written, beautifully written. It's actually quite humorous in parts, but very, very confronting to be in Siberia alone in a log cabin for 6 months. And all of his learnings that came out of that. It's a beautiful book. I really recommend that one. I'm in the process of creating a top shelf. You know, like if you have liquor on a top shelf, it's sort of the best of the best. And I'm collecting all my favourite texts and putting them on that top shelf. Yeah, because there's so many lessons of life from these amazing books. So yeah, that would be my top picks. Yeah, for philosophy. Yeah, yeah. I'm sure there's others that I haven't come across, but yeah, discovering a good book is one of the joys of life. Yeah,
that's awesome. That's amazing, Dr. Jane. Just to make a little summary of all the everything we just spoken on the talk on the podcast. So the first one, it's autonomy, right?
Yeah. Find your level of autonomy that that you're satisfied with, and that is within the realms of your reality. Yeah.
I love that. So the second, it's meaning and purpose in life.
Find at least one meaning and purpose for getting out of bed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the third one, it's the
contribute to the common good. Yep.
That's super important as well. The fourth one, it's master your ego.
Master your emotional experience.
Emotion. Yeah.
And the fifth one is master your ego. Yeah.
And
which you may spend your whole life doing. And that's all right.
That's awesome. Yeah. And of course, stay away from social media as much as possible.
I think everyone needs to come to their own decision about that.
Yes,
and that's, I guess, one of the main points of the podcast is there's no answer out there. You come to your own answer. There are some good probing, punch you in the face kind of questions, but your answer, how you live your life, is ultimately your decision and a result of your own reflection and knowledge of your values, your personality, and your interests. Yeah.
That's awesome. Are you living a good life right now?
Well, I think I lead a better life than I did I'm in my 40s. I lead a better life than I did in my 30s and certainly my 20s. And I hope that in my 50s I lead a better life than in my 40s, and that's what it is. It's a learning and something that you reflect on. I think it was Socrates that said, the unexamined life is not worth living.
Beautiful.
Yeah. I also think that the over-examined life is not worth living either. You can kind of be navel-gazing too much, but there's a balance, that there is time for reflection. And I think that life is imbalanced if there's no time for reflection. And in the recent COVID-19 lockdown, I do think that, from my observation, people have used it or some people have definitely used it for a time of reflection. And that's a good thing, because that's how we change and grow, is if we reflect. And if we don't have enough time to reflect, something is out of kilter.
That's so awesome. Dr. Jane, thank you so much. Yeah,
Thank you for having me.
No, we need to organize the next one already. Well, so cool. Yeah, I've been invited and waiting for the right moment. You super busy, but finally, yeah, and it was so worth it. Every single minute waiting for this moment.
Well,
Thank you so much. Yeah, and definitely, I'm gonna try to bring you back so we can keep this conversation because was amazing. Was really cool. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And we're gonna talk again. So if someone it's more interesting about what you're doing, how they can find you?
Not through Twitter. They can email me.
Okay. Can we leave your email on the description of the video? Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Callum.